Hello, Stitchers. Welcome to Stitch Please, the official podcast of Black Women Stitch, the sewing group where Black Lives Matter. I'm your host, Lisa Woolfork. I'm a fourth-generation sewing enthusiast with more than 20 years of sewing experience. I am looking forward to today's conversation, so sit back, relax, and get ready to get your stitch together. Hey friends, hey, it's Lisa from Black Women Stitch and the Stitch Please podcast. And as I say every other week, this is a very special episode because this episode asks, I think, a very important question. Is intermediate the hardest stage in sewing? You are not a beginner, but you're also not an expert. And as I was researching this topic, I found a lot of questions or things that made me ask a lot of questions. And the first is, what does the word intermediate mean to you and your stitching? Is it an invitation? Is it an affirmation? Is it an insult? Intermediate shows up in patterns, in classes, in conversations. Intermediate comes up quite often. And what I want to talk about is the way that we can approach what it means to be an intermediate sewist, an intermediate stitcher, an intermediate knitter, someone who is in the middle. Where does that leave you? And that's the conversation we are going to have today on the Stitch Please podcast. And I think as we go through this episode, I invite you to consider this. It doesn't matter what you're called. It matters what you answer to. And I want us to hold on to that as we move through why intermediate is such a vexed category. I was doing research for the episode, as I am wont to do, and that took me lots of places. And it led me to understand that there is a lot of uncertainty around the category intermediate itself. Folks are asking, what does intermediate mean? How do I know if I'm intermediate or advanced? How do I know if I'm advanced or expert? What are the levels? Are there 4 levels, 5 levels? There's a lot of uncertainty, but I'm talking specifically here about those folks who identify themselves and who describe their own sewing practice as intermediate. And also to think about how useful the word can be, or maybe how not useful it can sometimes be. So to start this section about the category of intermediate, I want to introduce a word that I like to use a lot. It's a very nerdy word, very professory word, and it's liminal. Intermediate is a liminal category, and that is something that academics like to do, including using em dashes, colons, parentheses, all over the place. We love to think about words and the word like liminal as really meaning in between. It's neither one thing or another. It is right in the middle. And I think that that's very interesting because there is a lot of space and energy that can happen in what it means to be liminal, even though it can sometimes be uncertain, and that uncertain can prompt anxiety. And as part of the research for this episode, y'all, I found the anxiety. It's my own fault for going to Reddit. I blame myself. I blame myself. I started looking at forums, and the forums that I went to were quite good and interesting, and they informed my understanding. Going to Reddit always it's so stressful. I don't know why I do it to myself. Well, I do it for you all. You're welcome. No, I do it because that helps me to kind of understand the shape of the conversation, but also to understand my own angle, which usually is completely different. But there was lots of anxiety and what felt to me like a bit of judgment. And this is what I would like to kind of consider here is that about labels and basically asking the question, what does the word intermediate mean to you and to your craft? That is as simple as that. The word intermediate implies a standard, just like any label. Labels imply a standard. If you don't subscribe to that standard, or if you don't know about that standard, that label may not matter to you. And the reason I mention this now is because I was really thinking about the episode in the context of what I have been seeing or thinking about as a crisis of expertise. That expertise seems to matter less and less in American society in general. The idea of being qualified for a position that you have, for example, used to be something we cared about in places like, I don't know, government. But now it doesn't matter if you are an expert or have qualifications. You could easily be placed by someone who um, doesn't even look good on paper. They just look good slightly in the face, and they are now the new head. So the reason I mention this because you have that on the one hand where expertise is very much disregarded, and then on the other hand, you have things like people saying pressing is elitist, or having certain standards around sewing is gatekeeping. Gatekeeping. I think the ways in which the word gatekeeping has been misunderstood is it defies comprehension. I'm not going to even talk about it. We might cut this part out. I don't know. Or maybe I'll come back to it later. You tell me. What I do want to share, though, is the reason I'm making this departure into expertise versus gatekeeping versus knowledge is because the folks who are interested in, who see intermediate and describe themselves as intermediate, I believe want to advance their sewing and want to know how to advance it. There's also a way that intermediate is, again, rich with possibility. And I want us to kind of think of ways to embrace every level of sewing that we're at. Embrace every level of sewing that you're at, all of the phases of your journey. I was a beginner, and then I grew and evolved and practiced and then became intermediate and continued to grow and evolved and became advanced and then continued to grow and evolved and became expert and continued to grow. Like, this is a journey that I believe those who are engaged in the craft of stitching, you want to get better because you want to make more interesting projects, etc. Now, there's some folks, and this is the last thing I'll say on this part before pivoting to what we're going to do in the episode. There's some folks who absolutely defy labels, that, they don't follow the program of beginning at the beginning and then the middle and then the end. They're able to jump right into the end and have excellent results. They are able to do that. There are some people who are able to do that. I think those people are called prodigies because they're able to develop this prodigious skill without all of the work. At the same time, they also do put in a lot of the work. But what I'm trying to explain is that the rankings only matter insofar as they are useful to you. The rankings only matter only insofar as they're useful to you. And that to me means, hopefully this will help destigmatize any stigma that might be around the phrase intermediate or even around this phrase beginner or expert, because it only matters insofar as it's meaningful to you. Now, I want to dive into where intermediate shows up. And there's three places where the word intermediate starts to matter. The first one is in an industry standard. Intermediate is part of a set of industry standards. The second place it shows up is in an external evaluation, when there's somebody outside of you looking and evaluating and interpreting your work. Intermediate also shows up there. And then finally, in a self assessment, how one individual thinks about themselves and their craft, that's also where intermediate shows up. So I want to dive in first to the industry standards. I looked specifically at the pattern industry, the sewing pattern industry, but you also see this in other craft and stitching spaces. There are 4 levels, though there could also be 3 or maybe 5. But for this purposes, I identified industry standards that broke this down into 4 levels. You have a beginner, intermediate, advanced, and expert. So these are 4 different levels that go in order: beginner, intermediate, advanced, and expert. Now, it's important to note that advanced could absolutely be taken out. And you could think about advanced as being more like a modifier than a level itself. So, for example, you could be a beginner and an advanced beginner. You could be intermediate, but an advanced intermediate, right? And that would be someone who is closer to expert than they are to intermediate, or they're in between. So these designations have the purpose of setting skill level expectations. That is why these terms are used. These terms are designed to set skill level expectations. This way, when someone buys a pattern, for example, and this shows up in two aspects of the industry, I'm going to talk about patterns and I'm going to talk about classes. This is where that designation or that description, intermediate, starts to make sense. Pattern sellers use levels to indicate the appropriate skills, vocabulary, and techniques that you will need to have to support a good outcome. For example, Simplicity Patterns, I looked at their website and they define intermediate as average rated patterns for expanding your abilities. And they add, quote, "You've got the basics down. Now tackle projects with new techniques, playful details, and small challenges to grow as a sewist." What's implied there for me is that you have specific skills you've completed often enough that you don't need explicit instruction to do them. You're able to install a button, put in a zipper, operate the sewing machine, change the bobbin, all of these different things. You're able to do darts. You're able to you know what it means to finish your seams. You stay stitch. You know what stay stitching is. These are intermediate things that they will do and want you to do so that the work comes out well. Hey friends, hey, it's Lisa from Black Women Stitch and the Stitch Please podcast. Our Patreon community is growing and we'd love to have you in it. We recently updated our membership tiers and now it's easier than ever to support the work of Black Women Stitch while getting exclusive perks just for you. You'll find full-length talks, behind-the-scenes updates, bonus episodes, and access to videos from the podcast and beyond. Your support helps fund the podcast, pay our team, and keep this movement going strong. Every dollar truly makes a difference. So if you've been thinking about joining, now is the perfect time. Black organizations face increasing funding challenges. Community support closes that gap. Head to our Patreon community and choose the tier that feels right for you. And thank you. In addition for patterns, in addition to those sewing skills, the patterns themselves might be more complex. The pieces of the pattern could be cut on the bias. The pattern pieces themselves, which would then require a lot of stabilization and that stay stitching. And so if you're cutting a bias dress and you're not stay stitching around the edges because you either want to skip that step or whatever, you will have a very not great outcome. So the pattern pieces themselves are a little bit more fussy. Similarly, there could be a lot of pattern pieces. So you're doing a pattern and you're cutting out 32 pieces. This happened to me when I was sewing for my children when they were very small. Like I have one, I don't know if this picture you can see it up behind me, but it's of my youngest wearing an epaulette button up shirt that, I kid you not, had 22 pieces. 22 pieces. And the child cannot stand on one leg. Okay. I'm just saying the child has just learned to like stand up and walk well. Like it's unbelievable. But yes, 22 pieces. The child, I think he had 4 teeth in that shirt pattern had 22 pieces. Yeah. I I I was an amazing mom. I'm an amazing mom. I'm just gonna leave it at that. So that's one of the reasons why a pattern would describe itself as intermediate, that there would be a lot of details that a beginner might be overwhelmed by or not want to do. Now, if you want to know for sure, this is how to confirm. Read pattern reviews. There's a site, patternreview.com. You can read reviews there. There are lots of different blogs. If you follow people on Instagram, they will sometimes have essentially a blog entry right there in that social post. Or follow some bloggers. They've got some, there's been some bloggers that have been on this program. Bianca Springer, Erica Bunker, Tiffany from Tip Stitched. Those folks are very often sharing the process of these makes. And this is another way that you can learn to see if this is right for you. I also want to give a shout out to Naomi P. Johnson for this gem. Read the pattern instructions 3 times. Read the pattern instructions 3 times. Read the pattern instructions 3 times. I say that because I too need to learn this or remember this, because if I read it one good time, I'm doing well. But and then I go complaining, and it's not a good look. Now, here's another place where intermediate shows up for classes and workshops. Classes and workshops might be described as intermediate or want people who are going to participate to have intermediate level skills. This helps support the instructor's approach. The instructors use these levels to support a good outcome for everybody, to get a good solid base, so that if, for example, there's one person with 24 students and everyone's intermediate, no one is needing help threading the sewing machine. People know how to use the bobbin. People know how to insert a needle. Like, these are things that beginners don't know how to do. And even at the intermediate level, if it's a machine that you don't know well, you might, it might take you a few minutes, but you'll be able to adapt to it rather quickly because you have the experience. There also could be intermediate skills in this workshop that students who are beginners won't know how to do. So the intermediate skills allow students to proceed through the class independently, to follow along with the instructor who is also pacing the class at an intermediate level. So the basics like threading a machine, reading the pattern, knowing the basic mechanics of a sewing machine, um, knowing seam finishes. These are some of the elements that an intermediate class might expect. Now, if you want to know for sure, look at project photos, ask the instructor any questions, specifically if there are tools you need for this class beyond a regular sewing machine. So this is a way for you to determine if you see a class and it's listed as intermediate and you yourself are feeling on the fence, ask questions, get more information, and that will help you know for sure. The second place where intermediate matters is external evaluation. This is not just your shady neighbor. This is just anybody. Anyone could, in general, interpret your clothes in a variety of ways. But I think what I'm talking about in particular is when someone is actually judging sewing in this context. That if you want to show a garment for a contest or for a competition, there are a variety of things that people will look at. Cosplay, for example, has build books where you have where you track your progress, where you go from idea to idea, like what you thought, what your idea was, to how you executed it, with all of the insides and outsides evaluated. There's so many rich detail. In general, however, in an external evaluation, people are interpreting the quality of the work, the technique, the finished, and intermediate becomes a way the work is evaluated. Now, finally, for self assessment, this is intrinsic motivation. How do you see yourself and your sewing? How do you see it? How do you understand it? What are your personal standards? How do you recognize your progress and skill development? So, what I want to talk about now are what these skills and standards are within each one of these categories. So that for the industry standards that say an intermediate class, for example, or intermediate patterns, I'm going to explain what they are looking for. So I'll just do a quick rundown of that, and you'll see. Hopefully, you'll start to see some things that run in common about what intermediate might be looking for. So for industry standards, in terms of a pattern, patterns that are intermediate can be determined based on their complexity, number of pieces, types of fabric used, shape of pattern pieces, the techniques required for a good outcome. These might want you to do, for example, make bias finishes, do welt pockets, have seam finishes like flat fell seams or Hong Kong finishes or French seams. Now, for classes and workshops, intermediate requires a certain understanding of pattern and sewing terms fluency, being comfortable with the machine and its main stitches, knowing how to change stitch width and length as needed. Now, for external evaluation, when someone is looking at your sewing, I went to the 4-H, and there was a 4-H in my region, the South Atlantic region, and I looked there at their guidebook, which I have a link in the show notes because I thought it was really useful, about how the 4-H judges the work of children. Okay, these are children aged 8 to 18. In addition to having to take a quiz on like the 18 to 24 parts of the sewing machine, right? Like, show me tell me, y'all, show me right now, what's the stitch up, the take up lever? Show me where that is. Like, you ask someone to do that, and some people aren't going to know what that is, but these children do. So here's what children aged 8 to 18 are being judged on in the garments they have made. If the fabric is appropriate, as are the notions, is cut accurate cutting and marking, seams appropriately finished, accurate hand stitching, stitch selected appropriate for situation, accurate machine stitching, and appropriate construction techniques, construction detail appropriate to fabric and style of garment. Closures are appropriate for the situation and applied appropriately and neatly, being clean and well pressed. 8-year-olds to 18-year-olds are being evaluated by that standard. So, that I thought was a good way to think about what an intermediate sewist should be paying attention to. For regular life, what I love about the external evaluation, beyond being I have not yet had my work evaluated by 4-H, but in regular life, it's awesome when people are like solely surprised that you're wearing what you made. I think people notice pattern matching, they notice boldness of print. Some might notice the top stitching detail, but I think truly those that care about good sewing notice good sewing. And so I think that that is one of the important elements of an external evaluation. Finally, self assessment. This is also an important element of being an intermediate sewist or being in an intermediate phase. How do you evaluate or measure your skills? Can you look back at early projects and notice a difference? Are there things that used to be difficult that are now much easier? Have you expanded your knowledge base with books, tutorials, classes, workshops, community groups, other resources? Have you put in your 10,000 hours? And that's a theory by Malcolm Gladwell about skill developing with practice, sustained practice over time, their 10,000 hours. Now, I've talked about where intermediate shows up and how. But as we wrap up, I want to think about how you can build your skills, and essentially, it is practice, and you can decide what you want to practice on. So, if you want to advance from intermediate toward advanced intermediate or expert, according to industry standards, sew harder patterns, do harder things, attempt harder skills, use more difficult fabrics. Similarly, if you want to look at how you might meet an external evaluation better, Submit your work for external evaluation. Not just asking your sewing friends, hey, what do you think about this? Which is a great place to start, or what could I do to get better? You can also submit them to fairs and contests and things like that. But I think getting feedback can be very helpful, direct feedback. And finally, in terms of self assessment, if you want to progress from intermediate to advanced or advanced intermediate or expert, focus on consistency, technique, but also being kind to yourself. Reflect on your own progress. And I think that this is going to lead me to the slogan of the Stitch Please podcast is that we will help you get your stitch together. And I think the thing today that I believe will help us get our stitch together is to remember to be kind to yourself, to reflect on your progress, to keep track of the work that you've done, take pictures of the inside and outside, feed your curiosity, develop your skills. And remember, intermediate is a liminal space. It's in the middle. It's neither beginner nor expert, but also it's a unique space for growth, possibility, and creativity. Thank you, and we'll see you next time.
You've been listening to Stitch Please, the official podcast of Black Women Stitch, the sewing group where Black Lives Matter. We appreciate you joining us this week and every week for stories that center Black women, girls, and femmes in sewing. We invite you to join the Black Women Stitch Patreon community with giving levels beginning at $5 a month. Your contributions help us bring the Stitch Please podcast to you every week. Thank you for listening. Thank you for your support, and come back next week and we'll help you get your stitch together.